Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Eniagulu. Now to political matters in the UK, where the past week has been an uneasy week for the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. His humanity and credibility have been called into question. First came the allegations surrounding his handling of the pandemic. He stands accused of declaring last autumn that he would not bow to pressure to impose yet another lockdown, even if it meant letting the bodies pile high in their thousands. And in Parliament last week, he said he did not say those words, but the allegations got more serious by midweek with potentially legal implications. The country's Electoral Commission said it's launching a formal investigation into how Mr. Johnson paid for the refurbishment of his Downing Street flat. Well, British Prime Ministers are allowed to just over $40,000 a year for decorating their accommodation, but Mr. Johnson's refurbishment did not, or rather did cost considerable more than that, and it's not clear how the cost of all that was covered. Well, Arise correspondent Faith Orr is a regular watcher of British politics, and she joins me now in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. So on the face of it, potentially appalling past week for the British Prime Minister. He's been buried under a load of hostile headlines from normally friendly newspapers, and his probity and integrity have been called into question. How do you assess the past week for Boris Johnson?
It's been a bit of a nightmare for him, frankly, hasn't it? He's been accused of lying, he's been accused of breaking the ministerial code, he's been accused of using donations to fund the refurbishment of his Downing Street apartment, which, I mean, some estimates £200,000 at that cost. He has been accused of saying that he would rather see bodies pile high than impose another lockdown. It's been a week that I think Boris Johnson would rather forget, and I think he would rather everyone else forgets it as well. That's not going to happen. One of the other accusations that he's also facing is asking the donors of his Conservative Party to fund his childcare costs. Now, the flames have been further fanned on that today. Downing Street are refusing to deny that that has happened. So they're not admitting it, but they're not denying it. And then again, when it comes to the refurbishment of this apartment, you know, the leader of the opposition in Parliament gave him a multiple choice question. Who funded it initially? Was it you, the Tory party, the donor? Was it the taxpayer? And Boris Johnson is just avoiding these questions. He's saying that he eventually covered the costs, which may well be true, but that's not the point. It's the point is who did it initially.
Absolutely.
So now there's the investigation, and it could get a lot worse for him.
How unusual is it to have the Prime Minister accused of lying in the House of Commons as he was? I mean, the Labour Party accused him of lying. The Scottish National Party asked him if he was a liar. We mentioned in the introduction that he said last year he was prepared to see the bodies pile high rather than introduce a third lockdown. And even though he said that was totally untrue, it was still reported as fact by the BBC and ITN.
It's really rare for this to happen. I think we all know that politicians, even politicians that we would consider to be particularly honest, will say things that they don't believe are entirely true, but it's very rare for them to outright lie. And the reason for that is simple. It's too easy for them to be found out. It's even rarer for an opposition to accuse the Prime Minister directly on the record of lying. But that is exactly what's happened in this case. Now, it's safe to say the sources quoted about the bodies piled high comment, with the BBC, with ITV, with Channel 4, all of these news organisations, if they're running this and running it as fact, it's a safe bet that these sources are trusted.
Absolutely.
And they have now actually said, the sources, that they are willing, if needed, to go on oath and swear to these comments. So that's not looking particularly good for the Prime Minister. Not just, as you said, the Labour leader that took a swing, SNP also said, they asked the Prime Minister if he was lying, and that's because parliamentary rules actually prohibit one MP from directly accusing another MP of lying. So the fact it's got to this stage means it's serious for Johnson.
But of course, Boris Johnson plays by different rules, doesn't he? I mean, there is a big set of local elections in the UK this week, and that ought to show whether the voters are paying much attention to this, because the latest opinion polls would seem to suggest that they are not.
Much of what happens in UK politics doesn't seem to reflect in the opinion polls. It doesn't seem to be affecting the Conservative Party much at all. And I think part of that is that Boris Johnson's reputation has never really been based on being squeaky clean. Voters sort of get a bit of, they expect these things, you know, what they see is what they get. But it's not great timing all the same, especially in Scotland, because while there are local elections in Scotland, it's actually the Parliament that's up for election. And the leader of the Conservatives in Scotland has been forced to admit in a political talk show that if Boris Johnson is found to have done these things that he's accused of, that he should resign. So while the polls aren't changing much, the opponents certainly still seizing on it, and we'll see what happens on election day.
Well, the opinion polls have consistently given the Conservative Party a solid lead over the opposition Labour Party. There was one even conducted at the height of this furore, which gave the Conservative Party an 11-point lead over Labour. They've been in power for 11 years, and I mean, you'd expect that, you know, by now the wheels would be starting to come off, but it doesn't appear so, does it?
I mean, it's remarkable. The UK voting public, they seem to say one thing in one poll. So are they satisfied with how the Conservatives, how Boris Johnson has handled the pandemic? No, they're not. They're not happy with the way that delays to travel restrictions have been put in place, the way that, oh well, maybe we'll have a lockdown this week, maybe we'll have a lockdown next week. So the polls, they say one thing, and then they ask who they're going to vote for. Oh well, we're still going to vote for the same people. So I actually pity the analysts and the pollsters in the UK that have to try and make sense of this, because it doesn't seem to make sense. The Tories, the Conservative Party, consistently ahead of Labour, showing that they are going to win this quite comfortably, regardless of everything that's gone on this week.
Is it possible to quantify what makes Boris Johnson a different type of politician, in that sense that he is potentially Teflon, that people kind of factor in a certain level of behavior, if you like, and disregard it as being significant when they go to the polls? What is it about him that achieves that?
I think even the fact that he's commonly referred to as Boris says something about it. You know, every other Prime Minister, every other politician, David Cameron was Cameron, Theresa May was May. Boris Johnson is the only one that is quite commonly just referred to as Boris, and there is that sense of familiarity, I think, which that leads to, but he's kind of cultivated that as well. You know, to explain why, I think we need to say that if viewers who aren't too familiar with British politics, they might not know where he came from. You know, he was a journalist. He has written many opinion columns for newspapers. He was a favourite on panel shows. For instance, Have I Got News for You? He was very much seen as a comic figure almost, and a respected author too. So he has this sort of colourful, varied past, and I think that allows the public to see the side of him that they want to see.
But on the other hand, I mean, it's quite extraordinary that people actually identify with him, because I mean, he's someone who's had a very, very privileged life. He went to Eton College, one of the most expensive schools in the UK. He went to Oxford University. What's your theory about that?
I think it's very shrewd. I think it's very intentional. I think he plays the part of the common man, much like Nigel Farage, who, you know, they present this sort of this image of being, you know, one of the guys down the pub, a beer in hand, and they try and make themselves seem like one of the voters. He is also described as shambolic, as clownish, a buffoon even. But he's no fool. He does make the public forget that he schooled at Eton, you know, one of the most elite schools in the world, that he then went on to study at Oxford University, where of course several of the British Prime Ministers have attended.
Absolutely.
You know, he excels in Latin, he excels in Greek. Boris Johnson is no ordinary man of the people, but that is the front that he puts on, and he entices people with it, this sort of bumbling appearance. And part of that, I think, is because he hedges his bets. So, for instance, with the EU referendum, 2 columns, one to remain, one to leave. He waits until the last minute till he decides.
Very, very interesting. We'll have to see whether things are going to get a lot worse for him as a result of this investigation. Faith, thank you very much indeed. We're much the wiser now. Faith Hall. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and London. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.